Thank you, Maggie. I was going to say that the best word to describe my career is long. And you've pretty much captured it in that sense. I'm very delighted to be here at the Clinton School. I'm grateful to Skip Rutherford, the dean, for inviting me. And I'm very grateful to Hoyt Purvis, my old friend, who suggested me as a possible speaker. Hoyt and I worked together for Robert Byrd when he was majority leader in 1979. I was kind of a minor figure on the staff, and Hoyt was the chief foreign policy advisor to Majority Leader Byrd. He was instrumental in a series of foreign policy issues of that time, ranging from the Panama Canal treaties to the recognition of China, to one of the last important meetings with the Shah of Iran, where Robert Byrd and Hoyt sat down with the Shah not long before he fell. It was no coincidence, actually. Hoyt Purvis was truly a giant in Washington. And he's been talking a lot about my book because he thinks it's a very good depiction of the Senate. He's also talking about it because he comes across very well in my book. You don't usually write about staff people that much, but he actually was quite instrumental at the time. I'm delighted to be in Arkansas, where there have been several political leaders who meant a great deal to me. I got to the Senate in time to work with two former governors of Arkansas, Dale Bumpers and David Pryor. And I want to thank Mrs. Bumpers for coming. It was very nice of you, and I hope you'll give my best regards to the senator, who we miss in Washington, but I'm sure you're glad to have him here. And David Pryor was a good friend of mine, and Arkansas has produced some great public servants. And of course, I feel most privileged to be here because I worked for Bill Clinton. I mean, it's special to me to speak at the Clinton School of Public Service. I've had the chance over my career to do a number of things, but without a doubt, the best years of my life, the most rewarding years, the most challenging years, were working in the Clinton administration, working in the Trade Representative's office, working across the street from the White House. We were in the executive office of the president, technically. We were back and forth there. And there are a lot of things you can do in life, but being part of that administration, and a successful administration, and some of the accomplishments really meant a great deal to me. I've always been grateful to the president, to Mickey Cantor, the trade representative, for hiring me, and to Mac McLarty for letting me actually serve. Now, everyone has their favorite stories about Bill Clinton. And you all, many of you know him better than I do, so I won't bore you with too many stories. But I got to meet Bill Clinton in September of 1991. Every other Democrat in Washington already knew the governor from Arkansas, but I didn't. And I went to a fundraiser for him, and he was 40 minutes late, which I gather was rather typical. He came in and he stayed for 2 hours, and he was absolutely mesmerizing. His intelligence and his communication and his empathy. And I'd known a lot of politicians by then. I'd worked for all these senators, but there was nobody like Bill Clinton. And I went home and I told my wife, I just met the next president of the United States. And she scoffed at me because everyone knew George Bush was going to be reelected. And I said, no, I met the next president of the United States, and I mean this next year, and I'm going to help him. So I helped Bill Clinton and fortunately got a job in the administration. And the reason I got the job was because we'd been out of power for 12 years, and everyone knew that if I didn't get a job, I would do something terrible, like kill myself. So I got this job. Anyway, a few months after the administration starts, I'm over at the trade representative's office, and President Clinton comes to a trade event, and he goes around shaking everybody's hand. And he comes up to me, and I said, "Ira Shapiro, Mr. President, I'm Mickey's general counsel." And the president says, "Yeah, Ira, I know." So I smiled. I said, "Oh, he really doesn't know, but that's good." So a few months later, there was another event, and I saw him again. And I said, "Ira Shapiro, Mr. President, I'm Mickey's general counsel." And this time he looks at me and says, "Yeah, Ira, I know." So I decided he knew. So a couple of years after that, President Clinton nominated me to be ambassador when I was doing trade negotiations. I'd like to thank President Clinton for that, but the fact is the Japanese were the reason I got the job. The Japanese were so upset that I wasn't an ambassador, that I didn't have the proper level of importance, that they insisted they wouldn't negotiate with me unless I became an ambassador. So the president said, "All right, we'll make him an ambassador." And that's sort of how it happened. I've always appreciated the ambassadorial rank and title, even though I don't use it that often. I sometimes use it, but not that often. But the main reason I appreciated it was a family story. And there are a number of you here who are at least my age, and you've probably had teenage children from one time or another in your lives. So my son was 15 at the time, and we didn't have that much communication. It wasn't his best period. Might not have been my best period. So I drove him to all these athletic events, hoping we would have some communication. And we didn't really. So one day I'm driving him to a soccer game. And there's dead silence in the car. He's in the back seat. I'm driving as a chauffeur for him and his friend. Nothing's being said. And all of a sudden, from the back seat, a voice is heard. "My dad's an ambassador." And then silence. But they didn't give him a country. Silence again. But if President Clinton's reelected, they may give him a country. But he won't take it because I have to finish high school. And I've never forgotten the thrill of my son actually understanding what I was doing a little bit. It's wonderful to see how much the people of America all appreciate President Clinton and his record. We've had a recent reminder of it, of course, when he spoke at the convention. Bill Clinton believed and believes that politics is an honorable profession, that government has an important role in our lives, and that reasonable men and women can come together to solve the most difficult problems. That's something that President Clinton and Secretary Clinton share in their views. And the president always nurtured that climate of trust and respect that made it possible to solve problems. And that's one of the reasons I admired him. The other thing that's special for me about this day, exactly 10 years ago today, I lost my one political race for office. I ran for Congress as a Democratic candidate in Maryland in a great race against one of the Kennedys, Mark Shriver, and Chris Van Hollen, who's gone on to be a great Democratic leader. And it was a good campaign, and it represented some of the best in politics. And one of the editorial writers in a local paper at the end wrote about me that my campaign had been the antidote to cynicism that I had promised. And that was really a wonderful thing to say, to be an antidote to cynicism, because there's so much cynicism about politics. And I think that's what Clinton has always stood for in my mind, that he's an antidote to cynicism, and that's what we all try to do. And I think there's really no accident about the fact that Bill Clinton started his political life working in the Senate for J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee during the Vietnam War, It was a time when a lot of us were drawn to the Senate. It was a magnet for people who wanted to be involved in government. And I guess the reason I wrote the book, enough about me, let's talk about my book. The book originated 4 years ago during the 2008 election. Such an exciting campaign that friends who had not been together that much, but had worked 30 years earlier in the Senate, came back together. We had breakfast every month or so, and we would talk about the presidential race, what Obama was doing, and Hillary and McCain, then later Sarah Palin. And then we would turn inevitably to the Senate and how it had become absolutely unrecognizable from what we remembered. Polarized, paralyzed, dysfunctional. And I walked out of one of those breakfasts and I said, that's it, I'm going to write a book about the Senate when it worked. The Senate that I called When It Was Great. Now, when you do something like that, you run into a couple of threshold problems. Was it really great? Was it only great because I was young? Was it only great because I was there? Fortunately for me, the research, the interviewing, and everything else confirmed the fact that we actually had, in the 1960s and the 1970s, we had a unique Senate. We had a great Senate. It was a Senate different from everything that came afterward. And it was a Senate different from anything that came before it. It was a progressive Senate at the cutting edge of change and all the major moral issues of the day. You can't think about anything that mattered in the 60s and the 70s without thinking about the Senate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the opposition to the Vietnam War, where the Senate was the forum for it, Watergate, the investigation the Church Committee did of the intelligence agencies, every environmental and consumer piece of legislation, it all originated, much of it from the Senate. They worked with presidents when they could. They held them accountable when they couldn't. They dealt with Johnson positively on legislation, and then they were his biggest adversaries on the war. They held Nixon accountable through Watergate. 5 consecutive presidents during that time failed to finish 2 terms in office. It was a very turbulent period of our history, marked by assassination, war, scandals, violence in the cities. The Senate provided ballast and gravitas and continuity. I discovered something that was in plain sight but hadn't been noticed before: the Great Senate. If you Google the words Great Senate, you'll find nothing except my book. Those words were never used before my book. And now the reviewers sometimes write, well, of course we had a great Senate in the 1960s and 1970s. Well, they didn't notice it until I wrote the book, but I'm glad that it's acknowledged that I was right. So it's important to understand the Senate that came before that Senate. For much of the 20th century, particularly from the second FDR term on to the 1960 or so, the Senate was an absolute obstacle to the nation's progress. It was the place where civil rights legislation was defeated and bottled up. It was the place where all social legislation went to die. It was the place, it was dominated, as you know, by the seniority system, which gave the Southerners a great deal of power. There was a time, by the way, Arkansas benefited from that. There was a time when 8 Senate committees, including the 4 largest committees, were chaired by the men from 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Arkansas. And Robert Caro, the great historian and journalist who's written about Lyndon Johnson and the master of the Senate. Robert Caro quoted another Senate historian as saying that the Senate was the South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. It was the one place where the South never lost the Civil War. And that was the way the Senate was, until Lyndon Johnson dragged it kicking and screaming into the 20th century. But even then, it only became great after Johnson went downtown as vice president and president, and the Senate was led by Mike Mansfield and became what I call the Great Senate. So what made it great? First, there was an unusual group of men. Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation doesn't need any footnotes or postscript from me, but it's a fact that the men that came out of World War II were an unusual group of people. If you fought at Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge or Iwo Jima, you didn't think that much about casting a few hard votes every now and again. And they had a sense of faith in the country, a belief in themselves, a sense of common purpose. They also believed in government. And they thought enough of our country that where there were weaknesses, they were prepared to remedy them. So they were unusual people. And they nurtured the younger people who followed them in the same way. A Walter Mondale or a Robert Kennedy or others who were born a little after that still had the same kind of ethos that they brought to the Senate. So they were exceptional people. But they also had a different concept of what it was to be a senator and to what it was the Senate was supposed to be about. And I talk about it as an unwritten pledge. The senators took a pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. But they had this unwritten pledge. And it was, if you give me the privilege of being a United States Senator, a 6-year term and perhaps multiple, usually multiple terms, a chance to range wide on the issues or dive deep on the issues, to deal with every foreign policy and domestic policy possible. If you give me those opportunities, in return for that, I'm a member of a party, and I represent a state. But what really matters is the national interest. That's what I'm focused on. And the Senate that I worked in, the Senate that Senator Hodges got to, it was almost a demilitarized zone where partisanship was concerned. There were incredible differences among the people, regionally, ideologically, etc. But it wasn't partisan, because they believed they were there to figure out the national interest. So that was their concept of being a senator. But there was also their concept of the Senate. And you can't understand the Senate that I wrote about without realizing that they didn't think their individual agendas were the most important thing. They all had individual agendas, but they recognized that the Senate was an instrument for collective action. And that meant at the end of the day, they had to reconcile their differences. They had extended debates. Then they had principled compromises. Then they voted, and sometimes you didn't win. But they did the nation's business because their agendas, their individual agendas, mattered less than the collective action of the Senate. And the other thing I would add is you can't understand the Senate, in my view, of that time without understanding the moral imperatives they were responding to: civil rights, the Vietnam War, the imperial presidency, which kind of combined with Richard Nixon. So they were responding to moral imperatives. But they also had this concept that nurtured trust and respect. And it came right from the top. Mike Mansfield, the majority leader from Montana, who I think is one of the underrated people of all American history. A lot of people remember him because he was ambassador to Japan for so long. The man was an extraordinary leader. He ate breakfast every morning with his best friend, George Aiken from Vermont, who was a Republican. It radiated out from Mansfield that we treat each other well. We follow the golden rule here. People, when he first became leader, people thought he was joking. You can't treat people that way. You've got to abuse them the way Lyndon Johnson always did. They didn't think Mansfield was strong enough. Mansfield didn't work that way, and he nurtured this climate of mutual trust and respect and bipartisanship, and it radiated through the whole place. For 16 years, he was leader. Now, I decided, with my publisher's help, my publisher said to me, "You can't write about 18 years of the Great Senate." I said, "Why not?" He said, "It's be too amorphous and unfocused. Find another way to tell the story." So I decided to tell the story by writing about the last years of it. Civil rights legislation's on the books, Vietnam War's over, Watergate is done, Nixon's gone. Robert Byrd and Howard Baker are the new Senate leaders. They come in, and it's the grinding business of the country, with energy problems, with economic problems, with foreign policy crises, with a new outsider president, Jimmy Carter. It's business as usual in a difficult time, and it turns out it was a time sort of like the time we're in now. But the Senate worked. That was the difference. Jimmy Carter last year made the comment, Barack Obama faces a lot of the same problems I did, but I had one advantage he didn't have. I had a Congress that worked with me on a bipartisan basis. Now, it's true that at the time, Jimmy Carter didn't always appreciate the Congress. But he recognizes he had a Senate that took him seriously. They respected the presidency even if they disagreed with him. They believed that the president was elected to set the agenda. You didn't rubber stamp his agenda. You worked with him. You tried to improve it. But you didn't obstruct it. You weren't there for that purpose. Barack Obama would have given anything to have had Howard Baker as his minority leader to work with these last 4 years. So there are a lot of stories, and I don't want to give them all away. But let me give you just a few quick examples of the way they did business. It's 1978. In a 6-month period, they just did one big thing after another. The Panama Canal treaties. They sold F-15 planes for the first time to Saudi Arabia. They bailed out New York City. They passed the comprehensive energy legislation dealing with natural gas. All that time, out in the country, there's a tax revolt that's sweeping in from California. The political action committees are getting active for the first time. It's the first time special interest grassroots lobbying is taking hold. The politics are moving to the right, but the Senate and the country keep doing the nation's business. So why did that happen? The title of my book is Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis, the Last Great Senate. So I always start with Howard Baker. Baker is the minority leader. He's from Tennessee. He's just become leader. Jimmy Carter decides we're going to have negotiate a new arrangement with Panama over the canal. Baker's reaction is, this is an unwelcome development. This has been kicking around forever. Why now and why me? His staff comes to him and says, Senator, if you want to be president, you've got to be against this. You'll never be nominated by the Republican Party to be president if you support this. And Baker's smart enough to know that. And he supports it. He takes the lead on it. He says it's in the national interest. It couldn't possibly get done without Howard Baker. And it didn't matter to him that it was going to hurt. It did matter to him, but he wouldn't put his presidential aspirations first. Now, a couple of months after that, and by the way, on the Democratic side, Frank Church of Idaho, a great anti-war opponent, one of the leading opponents of the Vietnam War. Church's staff says to him, "You're toast if you support this Panama Canal Treaty. You're done." And Church says, "It represents everything I believe about our relationship with the third world and what it should be. How can I be against it?" And so they say to him, "All right, you got to vote for it, but keep a low profile." He becomes the floor leader for it because that's what they were there for. That's the concept they had of being senators. So a couple of months later, New York City wants financial support. They had gotten it 3 years before, but they need more. The Senate Banking Committee is following the situation, and they say, "Absolutely not. We bailed you out once, we're not doing it again." William Proxmire, the chairman of the committee, is a real skinflint, and he's completely against it. But he says, "I'll give New York the chance to make its case." And New York comes in with a new mayor, Ed Koch, and a good governor, Hugh Carey, and two senators who were the greatest urban leaders of their time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Jacob Javits. And New York convinces the Senate that they need help. But the story isn't done yet. The Senate still doesn't want to set this precedent. And so Richard Lugar, who's just gotten to the Senate, and he's a conservative, kind of moderate to conservative Republican, he's new, he comes up with a tough love formulation. We'll give you the money, but we'll make it so tough that nobody else will ever be able to do it. And they did that. And they did it in a course of 6 weeks. They didn't do it for 5 years, they just did it. And at the same time, they're working on this energy legislation. Henry Jackson of Washington, a very powerful senator, who's the chairman of the Energy Committee, Jackson hates Carter. Carter beat him for the nomination. Carter's staff insulted him. He just hates him. They hate each other. You should read the Carter diaries. He really hated Jackson. And he doesn't even agree with him on energy. But he works tirelessly to come up with an energy program. He makes compromise after compromise. They spent 14 months on natural gas because Jackson recognized that Carter was the president and that the country needed to come together behind a policy. That's the way they did those kind of things. Now, at this point, you might be saying, hopefully, well, it sounds like an interesting book. It's interesting history. The Senate of today doesn't bear much resemblance to that. But we're in the middle of a presidential campaign, 7 weeks left, and it's fair to ask the question, even if the book is valuable and interesting history, what's the current relevance of it? I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it has a lot of relevance. I think it has a lot of relevance for this campaign, and I think it has relevance to making Washington work again, whoever our president is. First, it's relevant. Finds the water. It's relevant because the central campaign, one central question in this campaign, is whether Barack Obama deserves a second term. If we haven't had the robust economic recovery that we all wanted, is it Obama's fault? If, in the phrase that's used repeatedly, Washington is broken, shouldn't Obama be held accountable for not fixing it? Was he naive to believe that he could transcend the bitter partisanship? So in my view, if he was naive, it's because he was naive in believing the narrative about our country, that we come together in times of crisis. He became president in 2009 during the worst economic catastrophe in 80 years. We lost 750,000 jobs in 1 month. He had a right to believe that the Senate and the Republicans would work with him to try to succeed and to try to make the country better. And instead, all they did from day one was obstruct and oppose. And that's not consistent with the way it's supposed to work. So if he was naive in believing that the country's supposed to work a certain way. From the outset, they obstructed him on everything. They prevented the stimulus from being big enough. They ridiculed and obstructed and delayed the health care legislation. They opposed the financial regulation of the Wall Street banks that had pretty much damaged the economy. And they drove us to the brink of default in 2011. This is serious stuff. It raises fundamental questions about the way our system works. We're not a parliamentary system. We're supposed to have some degree of minority cooperation. And the Senate is the place where it's supposed to happen. The Senate, at its best, is what Walter Mondale once called our national mediator. It's where the differences, regional and ideological and party differences, get reconciled. That's the Senate at its best. That's the Senate I wrote about. The Senate at its worst, the Senate we've seen for any number of years, the Senate at its worst has the partisanship of the House and the paralyzing rules of the Senate. And the obstruction possibilities are endless, as we've seen. The world's greatest deliberative body, as it's often called, has become what George Packer of The New Yorker called the empty chamber. Olympia Snow, 3 years before she announced she wasn't going to run again, lamented that we have become miniaturized. And here's the connection between the presidential campaign and the Senate. I'm a lifelong, committed partisan Democrat. I fervently believe that it's important that President Obama be reelected. But as a student of American political history and government, I firmly believe that we won't have an effective government, we won't have a workable Washington until we restore the Senate. If not to its past greatness, then at least to respectability. So, how did we get here? And more important, how do we get out? The 1980 election is the end of my book in the narrative. It shattered the great Senate of the 1960s and the 70s. Very experienced, accomplished legislators, George McGovern, Birch Bayh, Warren Magnuson, Gaylord Nelson, Jacob Javits, Ed Muskie retired, Abe Ribicoff retired. Huge outflux of great legislators replaced by neophyte conservative Republicans, most of whom came without any accomplishments and left the same way, with that record intact. But the story wasn't done yet. There were still a lot of good senators there. It was a Senate of Byrd and Baker and then Bob Dole. It was a Senate of George Mitchell, Sam Nunn, Bill Bradley, Danforth, Lugar. There were plenty of good senators there. They knew how to do business. And so the Senate comes back together in the 1980s, and they start working again on a kind of non-ideological basis, particularly during the second Reagan term. Then comes the 90s, and things start down. And in my view, we're in a 20-year downward spiral that started in the 90s. Bill Clinton is now celebrated by everybody, but the truth is, Bill Clinton was the first Democratic president that faced Republican obstruction. He got no help when he came into office, and in fact, they went after him from day one with Whitewater and other things. It led to his impeachment. So that was the first time we saw this strategy. And two things have come together that I think are troubling. One is what I call the permanent campaign. It's what everybody calls the permanent campaign. It used to be you had these campaigns, the campaign was over, and then you got around to governing. It doesn't work that way anymore. The campaigns never end. The Senate has become an extension of the campaign. They line up on a partisan basis. When you see all those party line votes, you know that's not senators using independent judgment, because you wouldn't get to party line votes if you had independent judgment. So one thing is the permanent campaign. And the second thing, I have to say, is the endless move of the Republicans to the right. Each time you think they can't move any further right, they lurch further to the right in a series of lurches. And it started at its worst with Newt Gingrich in 1994 and his Senate counterpart Trent Lott. Alan Simpson of Wyoming once said, the Senate was basically the Senate changed when the battered children from the House came over, led by Trent Lott. That's specific enough. I think that's right. So we've had 20 years of the Senate's downward spiral. We became most aware of it only when Obama got elected, but it's been going on for a long time. So the question becomes, can there be a next great Senate? Well, can there be even a respectable Senate? And it's easier to be pessimistic than it is to be optimistic at the moment. Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, two of Washington's most astute scholars of Congress, have written a book in which the title is, "It's Worse Than You Think." And we all know the problems, the demands of fundraising, the harsh, shrill 24-hour media where everybody chooses their own news source, a political culture that now takes place more on Facebook and Twitter than it used to, a lobbying corps that has grown 5 times as large in the last 20 years, even though the members are the same number of members. So what's the positive way out of this? I think one positive thing is that if the public is frustrated with the Senate and angry, the senators are too. Most of the senators actually don't think they were sent to Washington to be part of a degraded, diminished institution. They thought they were sent to Washington to solve some problems. Not all of them, but most of them. So I think there's a possibility that they will change this thing over time. Now, they feel sorry for themselves. They feel trapped. They act like they're trapped in this hyper-partisan institution that's evolved. But my sympathy for them only extends so far. They have it in their power to change the Senate. They can change the rules if they have to. They can change the leaders, and they certainly should. And they can change their attitude. They can go back to being independent thinking people and not just partisan operatives. It doesn't take that much. And I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, in 2010, we had a lame duck session in which 8 senators, Republicans, told the leader, "We're not with you on don't ask, don't tell." And that legislation passed. 13 senators told him, "We're not with you on the START nuclear treaty." And that passed, even though you needed 2/3 of the Senate. When they started acting like senators and not just taking the party line, things changed relatively rapidly. So things can change. I've been encouraged by Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, former governor, Republican, who quietly left the leadership of the Senate, Republican leadership last year, because he didn't think he was functioning the way a senator should, and he didn't think the Senate was functioning the way it should. And I'm hopeful that more people will follow his example. I'm a radical on the rules. I think the rules should be changed. There are people all the time that'll say, the parliamentary experts will say, look, the Senate has worked for a long time with these rules. Yeah, it's worked badly with these rules. It's one thing to have a set of rules that says we're not going to roll over the minority party. It's another thing to have a set of rules that works on unlimited debate, unanimous consent, non-germane, that is irrelevant amendments, that allows a few people or even one person to tie up the nation's business. I think we need to reconceive those rules, and I think it can be done. I think it should have been done this last year because we didn't know who would be in the majority or who would be in the minority, but I think it can be done. I want to be clear about one point because I sometimes get asked this. I'm not saying that it's easy. Everything about our political culture has changed since the Senate I wrote about in the 60s and 70s. From televising the Senate to the nature of the media to the campaign fundraising demands, everything has changed. It's more difficult to be a senator now than it used to be. But that doesn't excuse senators from trying to be senators. The senators that I worked with and that I knew, they would never have gone down the party line the way they do now. The leaders wouldn't have demanded it of them because the senators wouldn't have done it. So they wouldn't have done it that way. So they have to go back to being senators. So at one of my talks, somebody asked me, he said, well, you seem to think they should rise above the partisan political culture they're in. I said, yes, that's exactly what I think. That's what they're there for. They're supposed to reconcile our differences, not reflect them or inflame them. And some of them do that. It's still possible. I see senators doing it every day, working away at it, trying to do the right thing. And then they go in and they're told by the leader, no, that's not our position. But it can be changed. Now, some people think that I'm very naive in thinking this. But right now in America, our government and our dysfunction is our fundamental problem. We still have the tools to be successful in the world, but we have a government that doesn't work anymore. And so we've got to find a way around that. And from my standpoint, you got to cut into the problem somewhere. It's naive to think that the campaign finance system is going to change rapidly, that we're going to go to universal voting, that the 24-hour media is going to change. I'd like to put my faith in some of the senators acting like senators and the Senate becoming more like the Senate used to be, because it doesn't take that many people to change it. The men and women who are in the Senate now and those who join it in 2013, they have one of the greatest privileges this republic can bestow on them. They're United States senators. They walk where the greats have walked. Let them repay us by putting country first and rebuilding the Senate and working with the next president, whoever it is. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for some questions. If you would raise your hands and let the microphones come to you. Any questions? We have one right over here, Kathy.
Thank you for coming. Welcome to Arkansas.
Thank you.
My cup was always half full until Citizens United, and then it really began to go down.
Right.
Can you tell us what you think may happen in the wake of Citizens United?
Well, I like to be an apostle of hope. I think my cup was pretty full, half full until Citizens United too. I mean, I think Citizens United was an outrage. You know, it was not good law. it's either terribly naive or terribly cynical, but it's both. I think we actually are going to have to do a constitutional amendment at some point on campaign financing. I think the only alternative in the short term is to emphatically reject a system that allows billionaires to dominate the process. And to some extent, I think that people are going to get saturated by all the ads that they're hearing. And I'm hopeful that at the presidential level, certainly, I think this rather close race, it'll be close till the end, but I think it will be decided in the context of the debates rather than the ads. Where the ads are most upsetting and the flood of money is most upsetting is in the Senate races and congressional races. And I think the press and the public are just going to have to push back against this flood of money. It's not a full solution because I think Citizens United was a shock to all of us.
Questions? Any other questions?
One question?
No, I've got one.
There has to be another question.
It's coming right at you. I've got one here too. Hold on.
I just need to know if the last part of what you said is in that book, because I need to buy it for my 33-year-old son and send it to him so he understands.
Well, it is
there's
in
a
the book.
difference.
And it's interesting because, look, most of the people who have been interested in the book are kind of my contemporaries. You know, remember that Senate, they're interested in it. But I really wrote the book for younger people. I wrote it for my daughter and my son and people to tell them that it wasn't that long ago that we had a government that worked. And I think that President Clinton did a lot to show, more recently, that you had a government that worked despite the adamant opposition that he encountered. And by the way, I should have said, if you look around the world now, governments are under great stress everywhere, without question. The European governments, you know, they've thrown out one incumbent after another. The Japanese have been stagnant for 20 years. They turn over their prime ministers every year. Economic difficulties put a lot of pressure on things and every government. But the reason that I wrote my book was our Senate started going down before there were economic difficulties. We're in a 20-year downward spiral. Our politics got unhinged from reality, got unhinged from everything else. So I did really hope younger people would read the book.
Question right here.
Interesting that you brought up Dick Lugar, because he just got beat
Yeah.
in a primary by a Tea Party person who was so upset that he would even attempt to compromise with anybody in the Senate. Let me ask you something. Where did the Republican Party go? And how long do you think it's going to be till it comes back?
Well, look, Dick Lugar is a very good example of a truly superb senator who got beat in the primary. Now, it is true that if you're 80 years old and you've been there 6 terms, you are vulnerable to the charge you're out of touch, particularly when you've been a national and international figure the way Senator Lugar had. But the idea that he was beaten by someone who said the real problem in Washington is that the Republicans are compromising too much, that's pretty scary. So I agree with you. I think the answer to that is defeating some of these people. And we saw that in the last election cycle when the Tea Party nominated somebody extreme in Alaska. They nominated somebody extreme in Delaware. And both of those seats went to other people. And I'm hopeful that the same thing will happen in Indiana. The only way you cure this, and Barack Obama said, I'm hoping that some of this anger will be drained by this election. But the only real way you cure it is defeating people emphatically enough that the party starts recognizing, I got to nominate different people. Or the party keeps going right, and then something else emerges, basically. There's no permanent guarantee that these two parties will last. Somebody said to me, don't we need a third party? I said, no, we need a second party.
As a diehard Democrat, I have to ask, what's been our part in this? Do you cover that in your book?
Well, let me distinguish two things about the book. The book goes from 1977 to 1980, and it's backlit by what came before. So it's about the great Senate of that time. And mostly everyone thinks it's pretty bipartisan. The epilogue gives sort of my explanation of the last 30 years, and it says that, you know, there are times when the Democrats behave badly, but most of the problem is Republicans. And my analysis, while it's that of a Democrat, is shared by moderate Republicans. Simpson, Danforth, Cohen. Look, Susan Collins, who's an old friend of mine when we worked together in the Senate, when she came back to the Senate now as an elected member, she was away 10 years. She said, I couldn't believe how much it had changed, that it had become so much more partisan. And it's the Republican Party primarily. Now, as I say, I can think of individual cases when I think the Democrats have not done really well, but they pale in comparison. And that's as my political historian self, not just my partisan self.
Any other questions? Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here.
Thank everyone.
Now, you just heard him laud Hoyt Purvis. You can read about Hoyt Purvis and many, many others, including some great senators, including Dale Bumpers, in this book. So I hope you'll buy The Last Great Senate and let Ira sign it. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me, everyone. Thanks for coming.